Hungry bear collapses on farmer's porch. What happens next will leave you amazed. The early morning air in the northern woods was biting, a sharp reminder of the unforgiving wilderness that surrounded Ethan Jacobs' farm. His cabin sat at the edge of the forest, nestled between towering pines that swayed with the wind. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, blanketing the land in an eerie, silent stillness. The world outside seemed frozen in time. The only sounds were the distant caws of ravens or the crunch of snow beneath Ethan's boots as he made his way across the porch. Ethan had always felt connected to the land. His family had farmed here for generations. It was a life that demanded patience, hard work, and a quiet acceptance of nature's rhythms. He had learned to rise with the dawn, prepare for the long winters, and endure the harsh conditions with a resilience born of necessity. This morning, as he checked the grain silos and started his chores, an undercurrent of unease lingered in the air. The usual stillness was tinged with something else, something more desperate. As he filled the bird feeder, he felt it, an unspoken tension clinging to the air around him. Something was wrong. The silence stretched too long. Ethan had just finished gathering firewood when he heard the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, labored and ragged, coming from the direction of his porch. His heart skipped a beat. His eyes darted to the weathered wooden steps, half covered in snow. And that's when he saw it. A massive bear, its fur matted with ice and its eyes glazed with exhaustion, was slumped against the corner of the porch. Its once powerful frame seemed frail, its ribs heaving as it fought for breath. The creature's dull brown fur, streaked with snow, was damp and stiff from the frigid temperatures. It barely seemed to notice Ethan's presence as it collapsed, completely drained. Ethan froze, his hand tightening instinctively around the axe handle. Bears were not uncommon in these parts, but this sight was beyond unusual. The farm was far from any known bear dens, and to see one this close to his home in the dead of winter, something was terribly wrong. The bear's eyes flicked up toward him, a mix of fear and desperation in its gaze. It was almost as though the bear knew it had reached the end of its strength and had nowhere else to turn. A wave of shock surged through Ethan. His first instinct was to retreat. Bears were dangerous, especially when distressed or wounded. A cornered animal could lash out unpredictably, and Ethan knew better than anyone that survival in these woods was a ruthless battle. But this bear, in its current state, didn't look dangerous. It looked broken. And something inside him stirred, a deep, familiar pull. He knew this creature wasn't here to harm him. It was simply hungry, desperate, maybe even on the brink of death. His mind raced. The bear was too far gone. Ethan knew he couldn't just turn his back. But the question, what should he do, hung over him like a storm cloud. Bears were wild creatures, not domesticated animals. Any attempt to approach it, to offer food, could be met with aggression or worse. And yet, the desperation in the bear's eyes, those same eyes that were now slowly closing as it sagged further into the snow, tugged at Ethan's heart. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees in a mournful cry. The temperature had already dropped below freezing, and the snowflakes danced violently around them, biting and cutting. The harsh cold would take the bear soon if it didn't find shelter or warmth. Ethan could see the shiver running through the bear's body, feel the wild desperation clinging to the air between them. This wasn't just hunger. This was an animal fighting to survive. Ethan stepped closer, his boots crunching softly in the snow, hesitant, unsure. The bear barely moved, but its ears twitched as if it was still aware of his presence. He could see the bloodshot whites of its eyes, hear the labored, wheezing breaths it was taking. His chest tightened. There was no mistaking it now, the bear was starving. It had likely been scavenging for food in these woods for days. He glanced quickly at his barn. The animals were tucked in for the night. He was alone here. No one would be able to help him if things went wrong. The thought of entering the barn and leaving the bear here to die in its suffering gnawed at him. But was he willing to risk his own safety for the life of a bear? A wild animal that could turn on him at any moment? The internal battle raged within him. He had always respected the wild, had always adhered to the rules of the forest, never approach an injured predator. But this was different. There was something deeply human in the way the bear was looking at him. Something he couldn't ignore. It was almost as if the animal was asking for help, a silent plea that stirred something inside him. Without thinking, Ethan slowly set the axe down on the porch. The heavy wood made a soft thud against the frozen surface. He took another tentative step forward, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, trying to avoid startling the animal. The wind howled, drowning out the steady beat of his heart. As he knelt beside the bear, he could see the blood smeared across the porch where the animal had dragged itself. Its front paws trembled as it shifted slightly, as if gathering the strength to stand again. But it didn't have the energy. Ethan felt a deep pang of sorrow. This was a creature, fierce and free, now reduced to nothing more than a shadow of itself. And it was here, at his doorstep, asking for help. He didn't hesitate this time. With a careful hand, he reached out to touch the bear's fur, his fingers brushing against its cold, slick coat. The contact sent a jolt through him, but he didn't pull away. He could feel the raggedness in the bear's breaths, the weight of its suffering. Ethan whispered softly. Though he knew the bear couldn't understand him, he spoke more to himself, trying to steady his nerves. "I won't leave you." The barn was close. But in the distance, the howling wind carried the sound of a wolf's distant cry, a reminder that the wilderness, despite its beauty, was unforgiving. Ethan glanced back at his cabin. He couldn't leave the bear outside to freeze, to die of hunger or exhaustion. And yet, he knew taking it into the barn, into the warmth, would expose both of them to further risk. Could he risk his farm's safety for the sake of this animal? Was he willing to face the moral consequences of stepping into the unknown? The bear shifted again, its body groaning in agony. Ethan's heart clenched. What was the right thing to do? His eyes darted to the barn again. He had one choice, to act now before it was too late. The storm was closing in fast. And this animal, this wild thing, had made its way to him. Ethan could feel his pulse racing as he reached for the shovel leaning against the porch railing. His mind was made up. He would take the risk. The bear had nothing left, no energy to run, no strength to survive this brutal winter storm. If Ethan didn't help, it would die here. Alone. It was time to break the rules, to cross the line that had always kept him distant from the wild. Ethan gathered the bear gently in his arms, carefully lifting its exhausted body. The cold fur felt like ice beneath his palms, but there was still warmth in the animal's body, and that gave him hope. He staggered toward the barn, every step laden with uncertainty, knowing that his life, his farm, and perhaps even his safety were now in jeopardy. Behind him, the wind howled louder, carrying the weight of the storm. The barn was his sanctuary, but the real question now wasn't about the barn. It was about whether he could live with the consequences of saving this creature or whether he had already crossed a line that would change everything. The bear's breaths were shallow and uneven as they reached the barn. Ethan had made his choice, but the storm was only just beginning. The barn door creaked open, its old hinges groaning in protest. Ethan pushed it with all his strength, heart hammering in his chest. He had only ever seen the inside of the barn through the lens of practicality, storage for tools, hay for the animals, a safe haven during a storm. But now, it felt different. It felt like a battlefield. Every inch of the barn, every corner, seemed to hold the weight of his decision. He could feel the bear's body, heavy in his arms, shivering uncontrollably as he carried it inside. The cold that had settled into its bones was almost contagious. The dim light from a single lantern flickered in the corner, casting shadows that seemed to stretch longer with each passing second. Ethan set the bear down gently on a bed of straw near the barn's rear corner, where the warmth from the cabin's heat could creep in. The animal's ragged breaths filled the space, and for a moment Ethan just stood there watching, unsure of his next move. The bear's eyes flickered open, a weak glance directed at him, filled with confusion and fear. Ethan swallowed hard. He couldn't ignore the animal's pain, it was too raw, too immediate. But even more pressing was the gnawing question that had been clawing at him since he first saw the bear on his porch. What was he doing? The bear could turn on him. It could attack him the moment it regained its strength. He knew the risk. He understood that helping this creature could end in disaster. Wild animals had no understanding of kindness, only survival. And Ethan was no fool. He knew how dangerous an injured bear could be. Yet his heart ached as he watched the animal struggle, its eyes pleading with him as if begging for mercy. But mercy could be a dangerous thing. He had crossed the line, stepped over the boundary he had always respected. The wilderness had rules, rules that could not be ignored, or else it would punish you. He knew that, and yet, he couldn't bring himself to let the bear die alone in the snow, suffering from hunger and exhaustion. Would he really just turn his back on this creature? Ethan took a step back, pacing in the tight space of the barn, his boots crunching against the straw. The wind howled louder outside, and the storm intensified. The light from the lantern flickered again, casting a dim glow over the barn. As he paced, his mind raced through the possibilities, the consequences. If the bear recovered, would it return to its wild nature, to its fight for survival? Would it be more dangerous for both of them when it regained its strength? Could he really trust that the bear would just leave once it was healed? Or worse, what if the bear never left? Ethan's mind split in two directions. One side told him that nature was better left to its course. The bear was part of the wild, and the wild had its own way of balancing things out. The storm was a natural force. The bear's hunger was a result of its struggle to survive in harsh conditions. Who was he to interfere? The other side, the side he was struggling to silence, told him that this bear's suffering was not just a part of the wild's brutality. It was a choice. He could choose compassion. He could choose to break the rules, even if it meant taking a risk, even if it meant standing between the bear and the storm, between the animal's suffering and a hard, cold death. Ethan stopped pacing and looked back at the bear. It lay there in the straw, its body trembling as it let out a soft, pained groan. The bear's chest heaved, and its breathing was shallow, its ribs visible beneath the fur. His heart twisted. This bear was not a monster. It was not the wild creature that would one day tear his life apart. It was a mother, a fighter, broken, exhausted, desperate. And in that moment, it was a living being who needed help, not a threat. He crouched down beside the bear, studying its limp form. The storm outside raged, but inside the barn, the air was thick with tension, suffused with a sense of urgency that mirrored his own internal battle. Ethan reached out slowly, the warmth of his hand a small comfort against the coldness of the barn. He carefully touched the bear's fur, letting his fingers gently trace its back. It was still warm, a flicker of life beneath the exhaustion. "I can help you," he whispered, though he knew the bear wouldn't understand his words. "I won't leave you to die here. You're not alone." But even as he spoke, his doubts gnawed at him. What if he was wrong? What if he was making a terrible mistake? The reality of what he was doing crashed down on him like a falling tree. He was not just risking his own safety but the safety of the farm, his livelihood. If this bear recovered and became aggressive, it could ruin everything. The barn, the livestock, the peace he had fought so hard to maintain. What if he couldn't control the consequences? A low growl broke his thoughts, and for a split second, his heart stopped. The bear's eyes flickered open, locking onto him, a deep rumble coming from its throat. But it wasn't the growl of aggression, it was the sound of fear. The bear, too, was torn, caught between instinct and the need for comfort. It was a vulnerable animal, torn between the wild and the uncertainty of survival. Ethan held his breath, motionless. The bear shifted, its muscles twitching, and for a moment he thought it might attack. But it didn't. Instead, it let out another weak groan and lowered its head back to the straw. A sigh of relief escaped Ethan's lips. For the first time, he realized that the danger wasn't immediate. The bear wasn't a threat, not yet. It wasn't even capable of being one right now. That realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He couldn't wait anymore. His decision had been made, whether he liked it or not. Ethan was already in the depths of it, facing the consequences. And he would stand by the choice he had made. He had to act. Ethan stepped away from the bear, moving quickly but carefully. He gathered some hay and piled it near the animal to create a barrier, a place of comfort. He made a makeshift shelter, ensuring the bear would stay warm in the worst of the storm. But then, he hesitated. He had the resources. He could give the bear food, grains, meat scraps. But he didn't want to risk being too close. He could provide the warmth of the barn, the protection from the storm. But what about the bear's instincts? Ethan glanced at the door of the barn, his mind racing once again. There was no turning back now. He reached for the food in the corner, grabbing whatever scraps he could find. Slowly, cautiously, he placed the food near the bear, but not too close. The bear lifted its head again, sniffing the air. Its nostrils flared, and for a long moment, it seemed uncertain. Then, almost hesitantly, it crawled closer to the food, its movements slow and stiff, still recovering from its ordeal. The barn was silent except for the rustling of the bear as it began to eat. Ethan breathed out in relief, a weight lifting off his shoulders. The bear, though still fragile, was showing signs of recovery. He had chosen compassion, had chosen to break the rules, and in this moment, he understood something important. Compassion was not weakness, it was strength. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the barn, the bear was no longer alone. Neither was Ethan. As the storm raged on, Ethan sat down across from the bear, keeping a safe distance. He wasn't sure how things would unfold, but he had made the right choice. The consequences, whatever they may be, could no longer overshadow the one thing he had the power to give, a second chance. The storm raged for hours, howling through the barn's wooden walls, but inside there was a quiet stillness Ethan had never expected. The bear, once so close to death, was now resting in the corner of the barn, its breathing steady but slow. Ethan sat nearby, watching, his gaze never leaving the animal that had moments ago been a shadow of its former self. The food had been consumed, and the bear, though still weak, had begun to regain some strength. Its muscles twitched with nervous energy as it rested, the exhaustion of the storm and the cold beginning to fade from its body. Ethan couldn't help but notice the subtle shift. There was hope now, where before, there had only been despair. The barn, which had always been a place of practicality, had transformed into something sacred in Ethan's eyes. It was no longer just shelter from the storm, it was a place of refuge, a sanctuary where both the wild and human had found a moment of understanding. Ethan had crossed a line, yes, but it felt as though that line had been drawn for a reason. In helping this bear, he had not just saved a life, he had bridged the gap between human and animal, between compassion and survival. As the night drew on, the storm began to subside, the winds easing into a steady, quiet snowfall. Ethan had always been comfortable in the quiet of the wilderness, but tonight the silence felt different. It was as if the world was holding its breath with him, waiting for something more. The bear, though still weak, was a living testament to the bond they had shared in that moment. At sunrise, Ethan stepped outside, feeling the crisp morning air cut through the remnants of the storm. The world was covered in a blanket of white, pristine and untouched. He glanced back at the barn, his heart swelling with something he couldn't quite name. He had done something he thought he could never do. He had chosen compassion over caution, and it had paid off. The bear was still in the barn, but now, when Ethan stepped inside, it didn't look quite as fragile. Its eyes had gained clarity, the pain in them replaced by something else, resilience. It looked at him for a moment before rising slowly to its feet, its legs trembling but strong enough to carry it. It took a few shaky steps toward the door, as if sensing the change in the air, as if knowing it was time to leave. Ethan stood still, watching the bear's every movement. The bear paused before the open door, its body poised at the threshold. For a long moment, it seemed as though the creature was contemplating something, perhaps the storm it had weathered or the decision it had made in trusting him. The silence between them stretched, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Then, without another sound, the bear stepped forward, its large paws leaving faint imprints in the snow as it disappeared into the wilderness. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched it go, a mix of relief and sadness flooding him. He had saved this bear, yes, but he had also given it back to the wild, where it truly belonged. He had acted out of compassion, but now he had to let it go. That, too, was part of the decision. He stood there for a long time, his breath clouding in the cold air, staring out at the open field where the bear had vanished into the trees. It felt as though something inside him had shifted, as if a part of his understanding of the wilderness had deepened, grown more profound. Ethan had always known that life in the wilderness was harsh. Survival meant choosing when to act and when to let go, when to intervene and when to step back. But the decision to help, to offer aid when it seemed so against the natural order, had changed him. It wasn't just about the bear. It was about something larger. It was about connection, about the threads that bind all living things, human and animal alike. He turned back toward the barn, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. The barn had been a place of refuge, not just for the bear, but for him as well. It had shown him that sometimes the most important thing we can do is to reach out to help, even when it feels risky or uncertain. Compassion wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It was the very thing that bridged the gap between the wild and the human heart. As Ethan made his way back to the house, he felt a new sense of peace settling over him. The farm, the woods, the barn, these had always been his life. But now, they were more than just places to work and survive. They were a living part of him. He had learned that the wild could be both beautiful and brutal. But it could also be full of grace, of quiet moments where even the fiercest creature could be tamed, not by force, but by kindness. And so, Ethan stood at the threshold of the farm, watching the sun rise over the snow-covered fields, feeling an overwhelming sense of connection to the world around him. He had acted with compassion, and in doing so, he had made a choice to connect, to protect, and to honor the wild, no matter how fierce or fragile. In the end, he realized it wasn't about the bear. It wasn't about him either. It was about life, its fragility, its strength, and the simple, quiet moments of compassion that make it worth living. As the last flakes of snow fell, Ethan smiled softly, knowing that in that one decision, he had found something deeper than survival. He had found a bond that would stay with him for the rest of his days, a bond that was not just about helping others, but about understanding that sometimes the wild can teach you more than you could ever imagine. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming wildlife tales that showcase the powerful connections between humans and animals. By subscribing, you're supporting the creation of more inspiring content that celebrates the beauty, struggles, and triumphs of wildlife. Every like, share, and comment helps us reach more people who need to hear these authentic, touching moments of compassion and survival in the natural world. Join our growing community of animal lovers and be part of something meaningful. Let's continue to spread the message of kindness, respect, and the deep bond we share with all living creatures. Your support makes a difference in bringing these emotional real-life stories to the forefront. Together, we can inspire the world. Thank you for being part of this incredible journey.